Sorry. Yeah.
I've got to do this for occupational health and safety purposes. First of all, toilets that are available on the upper landing across here, accessible male and female toilets. If in the event of a fire or any need to escape from the building, the best place for us to go is to follow the double yellow lines there and up out through the red door and down the back of the building. Okay? All right, sorry. So follow the yellow lines out through the red door in that balcony, or out through the shop on this side, depending on where the unlikely event happens. But I've just got to make sure you know that. The other thing I wanted to make sure everyone's aware, all of the people working in this museum are volunteers, and you are welcome to give us a donation at any time to help us with our costs and things like that. I've got a little gadget that will collect money. Hopefully the shop will be open afterwards. Just there's a problem with the internet at the present moment, but I'll sort that out hopefully. No, Peter.
Thank you, Dr. Delaney. In this talk, I'll give two examples of how Sydney's transport history has influenced and been influenced by political decisions and preferences. Before I begin, I must say I'm especially indebted to the Inner West Council through the Mayor, Mr. Darcy Byrne, to Miss Amy Czar of Council, and to Messrs. Bob Goyer and Duncan McCausland of this bus museum, all of whom had the job of making this all work. It's fitting that this talk is being held in a former bus workshop, which in 1915 bravely started life as an operational tram running shed, but like so many tram aspirations of the time, never quite made it. There isn't time this morning to recount all the political events that shaped Sydney's transport, which in turn was shaped by events outside the transport field, so I will recount two only. One of the 1920s and 30s, and the other in the 1960s to the 1980s. For a full understanding of how politics and transportation are inexorably linked, I can do no better than quote Malcolm Wax of the University of California, who in 1995 wrote that transportation decisions are made in the political sphere, and no analysis is complete without the political dimension. Before I go on, can you all hear me clearly? Right. Can you? Do I? Is that better? Hello, is that better? Is that better?
Yeah.
That better? Okay. Returning to Martin Wax, he noted that because transportation decisions vitally affect the lives of ordinary people, for good and ill, people react in various ways to government decisions and announcements, and the aspirations of one group inevitably conflict with the aspirations of another. I noted a recent such an example regarding the Roseville Road Junction, which has been in the news lately, as you know Emily too well, when television coverage of a very angry group of residents included a shot of a lady, presumably a car driver, saying that traffic flow would be improved if, pardon my language, and begin quote, the government got rid of those bloody bus lanes, end quote, apparently unaware that Okay. Apparently unaware that on bus lanes, as I said, the lady objected. I'm sorry about this. you, Amy. Okay, the vested interests I spoke about include politicians, public servants, transportation managers and vested interests include politicians, public servants, transportation managers and employees, manufacturers.
Shall we try it without the microphone? Yeah. I think we might need
You could move the people at the back up to the front of the
If
bus.
you'd like to move forward if you can't hear from the back.
That's why I always choose the front row.
I like to take photos, plus yeah, my hearing's fading a bit too.
Vested interests include politicians, public servants, transportation managers and employees, manufacturers, suppliers and financiers, and in the 1920s, the growing motoring lobby, which glamorised motor ownership and usage. The reasons for this are obvious. Transportation and public works provide influence, prestige and the financial life support we all need. In 1985, a British writer noted that a public transport system needs a measure of political control to ensure that its business is conducted on the broad lines of policy for which the electorate has voted. But it doesn't need political involvement in its professional management, nor should it be subjected to radical changes of direction upon a change of government. It was precisely those influences which adversely affected the development of Sydney's land transport for many years, and which I propose to review in the first part of this talk. Until comparatively late in the 20th century, government in New South Wales was unstable and changes of government were frequent. Between 1856 and 1925, there were 27 changes of government and 41 changes of premier, although some premiers served more than one term. All but 5 were minority governments, largely run by ministries elected by MPs who, in return for electoral support, secured concessions for their electorates and probably for themselves as well. Thanks, Amy. Sydney's sparse suburban railway network is a direct result of the dysfunction I just mentioned, because country MPs voted en bloc against proposals to build purely suburban lines, arguing that country interests should take preference. There was some justification for this, as railways were farmers and graziers' only means of getting stock and crops to the city, but for many years it meant that Sydney's development was restricted, as the only means of intensive public transport were slow and cramped horse-drawn buses. Horse buses could successfully compete for patronage with steam trains. Number 5, thanks, Amy. Which first appeared in 1879, but they were no match for electric trams, which appeared in earnest in 1899. From January 1901, horse buses were licensed by the Police Traffic Branch, ultimately responsible to the Colonial Secretary, and tramways were controlled and run by the Commissioners for Railways and Tramways, which meant that street transport was controlled by 2 government agencies working in tandem. This system of control, however, was inherently dysfunctional, as from earliest days, authorities had licensed all applicants for horse bus licences on the grounds that a large number of buses kept fares down, besides being a
handy source of government revenue. It didn't matter when trams swept all before them, but after 1918, when motor cars and buses rapidly began to appear, the policy of licensing everyone who wanted to run a bus created real problems. The tram's demise was forecast long before the 1930s, when it looked as though it might become a reality, and the first serious mention of this that emerged, believe it or not, from Balmain and the 7. While the writer's disaffection stemmed from ferry services and not trams, the seeds of eventual removal were sown and nurtured by the Sydney Morning Herald, which published at least 2 informative articles on the subject. The Herald's article of 31st of March 1985 is the first that I can find that directly called for an end to Sydney's trams, and it is obvious, in retrospect, that many people, besides the growing motoring lobby, were already speculating on the future of a tramless Sydney. The calls stridently increased in the 1920s, especially as the Tramways Commissioners had experimented with steam-driven motor buses in 1906, and only the poor road services had prevented their extension. Motor buses provided the first real threat to the tram's existence, and few tramways were built after the First World War. The Railways Commissioners, who also ran the tramways, asked the police not to licence buses over tram routes, but the Crown Solicitor ruled that the Metropolitan Traffic Act didn't permit such a restriction. It seems that government generally was reluctant to move against the bus proprietors, most of whom were returned services men and women, generally held in high public esteem. The tramways employees viewed motor buses as a threat to their jobs. And were openly hostile to bus drivers and owners, in some cases, according to anecdotal evidence, ramming buses with their trains. Ultra-conservative members of Parliament intervened in favour of the bus men and women, arguing that conservative governments had no right to regulate free enterprise bus owners, and they were backed by the powerful motoring lobby of manufacturers and motorists, which grew rapidly in the 1920s. Governments routinely and drastically reversed the decisions of their predecessors, and the police often found their decisions invalidated through the representation of someone who could swing a decision another way. The result was an oversupply of public transport and a never-ending scramble to get whatever cash was going, irrespective of the fact that most private bus proprietors were undercapitalised and some buses actually dangerous through inadequate maintenance. Corruption appears to have been endemic, and one MLA, and Dominic Fitzgibbon, who ran buses in Ashfield and Dulwich Hill, were prosecuted for attempting to bribe the Colonial Secretary into giving Fitzgibbon another bus licence, which in fact had been promised to another bus company. The post-1920s political stability I mentioned previously is due to 2 of the most unlikely factors. The first was the rise of the Country Party after 1918, which, in effect, formed the largest and best organised faction Australia had ever seen. Unlike other political parties, it never sought government in its own right, but played off Labor and Conservative parties against each other to secure benefits for country electorates. The continuing conflict between the various tram and bus interests diverted attention from country matters, and the result was the Transport Act of 1930, seen through Parliament by the Country Party's eventual leader, Colonel Michael Roxton, which gave the party
Transport.
gave the party a toehold on what was obviously a portfolio crucial to the advancement of country interests. However, thanks to the continuing ultra-right opposition from the Nationalist Party, Brooksner was forced to cede absolute control of Sydney and Newcastle tram and bus services by establishing separate, multi-interest transport trusts for those cities. Because of the nationalist rebels, Brooksner got the bill through Parliament by 2 votes only, just before the Conservative coalition lost the 1930 election to the Labor Party and its leader, Jack Lang. By this time, the continual competition from road transport, both trucks and buses, was financially hurting the railways and tramways, New South Wales' biggest revenue earners. So in 1931, Lang drove the competition off the road by imposing crushing taxes on them. The following year, he simply abolished the statutory transport bodies, railways, tramways and main roads, sacked their department heads and centralised control of all transport matters in a newly created Ministry of Transport. Lang, however, didn't remain in office long enough to effect any improvements. The second factor, after the emergence of the Country Party, was the unwilling collaboration of its leader, Michael Brooksner, with his nemesis, Jack Lang. Lang's centrist policies and execution of them played right into Brooksner's hands. When the Conservative coalition won the 1930 election, Brooksner, as Deputy Premier and Minister for Transport, found himself in sole control of all transport matters crucial to country electorates' interests without the need to consult the multi-interest transport trusts he had been forced to create to keep the UAP, United Australia Party, happy and which Lang had abolished. Brooksner established the departments of main roads, railways and road transport and tramways, each headed by a commissioner responsible to himself as minister. This marked the formation of Sydney's transport system largely as it remained until the 1980s. Trams have been removed from railway control in 1930. The Department of Road Transport and Tramways, as its name suggests, ran the tramways, ran its own bus service, which began on Christmas Day 1932, and licensed private bus services. The government-run bus network established quickly, and attempts were made to replace trams with buses on outer suburban tramways. But in 1933, the introduction of attractive new corridor trams largely foiled the move, as residents wanted them rather than the buses, which eventually took over. Politics again played its part. William McKell, Premier from 1941, wanted to replace trams by buses because of the heavy capital cost required for trams, tracks and generating equipment. But in 1947 he was replaced by James McGurk, whose government became increasingly dysfunctional. McGurk couldn't afford the tram versus bus controversy which the parliamentary opposition exploited, and the subject drifted along until, in 1952, McGurk was replaced as Premier by Joseph Carr, a much more experienced politician and administrator. Carr secured a large majority in Parliament in 1953, thereby spelling the end of Sydney's remaining trams, which finished in 1961. By then, public support for Sydney's trams had largely waned. The 1930-1932 Acts formed the basis of Sydney's transport policy until the 1980s. Each bus proprietor had to hold a service licence, renewable yearly, and the department set fares, routes and timetables. This procedure remained unchanged even after private bus controls were transferred to a newly created Department of Motor Transport in 1952. This brings us to our next political joust, the Free School Travel Scheme and creation of the Urban Transit Authority, intended to oversee both government and private bus services, both of which forced the end of the 4 Acts of 1930 to 1932. The Free School Travel Scheme was introduced following an election promise by the New South Wales Liberal Country Party, which won government in 1965. School students living more than 3 kilometres, about 2 miles, from their nearest appropriate school, including private schools, were entitled to free travel to and from school on private buses, and bus owners were paid by the Department of Education. Naturally, all parents of eligible children applied for passes, even though, as it later transpired, many children never actually used them. You can see the result in the number of passengers supposedly but not actually carried. If I just may demonstrate here. Look at the slowing patronage from 1951, long straight above there, dropping rapidly until 64, 65, and then rapidly shooting up again. That was because all of the Free School Travel Scheme passengers, the bus owners, had to report their patronage to the Department of Motor Transport, and of course they had no idea of how many children used the passes, so they just had to include them in the number. Back to the script there, Jamie. In those pre-Opal days, there was no method by which pass usage could be checked. Bus proprietors therefore had to be paid according to the number of student passes issued, after verification by the Department of Education. The rate of payment was set at approximately 95% of the children's fares, allowing for possible absence, as set out in each operator's fare schedule, which formed part of his or her service licence. Unlike today, there was no standard industry-wide fare schedule. The sole criterion was the children's fare set out in each operator's service licence under the Transport Act of 1930, and these varied from operator to operator. Until the private bus industry was drastically reformed in the 1980s and 90s, it was very much a cottage industry. Even in 1983, there were 77 bus operators in Sydney alone, some with only a few buses. Free school travel was obviously a vote winner, and both Coalition and Labor governments extended this scheme to such an extent that private bus operators had to provide buses with their high running costs simply to carry students over a kilometre or so, a long way from their owner's depot. The result was an increase in operating costs, which over time was met, inter alia, by raising children's fares to 3 cents above half the adult fare, and these increases were paid for by the Department of Education through the Free School Travel Scheme. The Askin government was the winner of the deal, as in 1964-65 the economy was expanding. It was a different story when in 1976 the Rand Labor government was elected. Economic inflation and unemployment began to increase, and were aggravated in the 1970s by, among other reasons, the fuel price increases imposed by Middle Eastern supply sources. Inevitably, the hike in fuel costs flowed onto other cost items, and rising inflation resulted. One of the Rand government's first acts was to investigate where private bus cost savings could be made, but the lack of standard fare schedules and actual pass usage made this difficult to achieve. Granting of successive fare increase applications made by the Bus and Coach Association on behalf of all private bus operators were delayed, pending review by a Cabinet Finance Committee, and the Commissioner for Motor Transport was not permitted to make those payments retrospectively, which had been previous practice. Government review was essential because when fare scales were increased, both adults and children